Hello, I'm Fei Kwan and you're watching It's About Youth. Autism Awareness Day falls on April 2nd every year. And with millions worldwide living with Autism Spectrum Disorder, also known as ASD, stigma and misunderstanding still persists. Joining me on a discussion to sort of change the narrative today is Charlene Marie Samuel. She's the Director of Autism Behavioural Centre, and Katyana Azman, a consultant psychologist at Pantai Hospital KL. Welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for joining me. It's a very important discussion today. Now, firstly, let's start with where Malaysia stands in terms of awareness. Both of you, have you noticed, any changes, any progress, especially in the last few years? Charlene, we'll start with you.
Definitely significant positive improvements in the awareness of autism. 15 years ago, when I first started in the field as a therapist, I was mostly working with older individuals. So they were 7, 8, 9-year-old kids, teenagers. So that was the common age to receive intervention. And today, in ABC, a majority of the children we serve start as young as 15 months to 24 months. Okay. So there has been a complete shift, I feel, of education, awareness, acceptance. It's definitely improving in KL at least. Yeah.
And Katyana, what are your observations?
I'd have to resonate with what Charlene is saying. I haven't been in the industry as long, but there's definitely been a positive trajectory with regards to awareness. A lot more parents are coming forward with toddlers asking, I'm noticing these things, is it something that we can assess for? Whereas, again, when I started working 12 years ago, it was not something that I felt people were very verbal about and knowledgeable about. So we're seeing a departure of people using terminology like slow learner and things like that, and rather being able to say, I'd like my child assessed for ASD. So definitely a lot more awareness, and I think with that some acceptance when it comes to that as well.
That's great to hear. The acceptance part is what's really important, right? I'll get into that a little bit more later. But Katyana, in your experience as a clinical psychologist, what would you say are some of the main challenges that neurodivergent youth face in Malaysia?
I think it's about the fact that, like with anything, they tend to get pigeonholed, right? When you have a diagnosis, whether it's medical or psychological or neurodevelopmental, there is a tendency to kind of assume that they're limited by their diagnosis. And so what I find the challenge is having these individuals' environments accept and embrace the fact that they have strengths and weaknesses that aren't reflective of the label itself. So you see some children who are extremely gifted in certain subjects not being able to participate in that in, say, a public school setting. We see, working individuals who might struggle with, for example, organization and focus and social skills, not having the work environment that understands and supports that. So I think it's about having them kind of be out in the world and kind of doing the things that they need to do, but having the label or the image of ASD kind of limit them. I feel that's kind of what I hear a lot with the individuals that I work with.
Kind of putting them in a box the moment, there's that diagnosis.
Yeah.
Is that right? But when talking about more parents coming forward with their children with suspected autism behavioral ASD, what are the current available resources and support systems that we have for families or individuals with autism in Malaysia?
All right. So first thing, I think a lot of families may not be aware, within the government setting in your clinic kesihatan, there are early screenings for autism. But somehow there are many families that are not aware of this. So, the government is taking its steps to identify it early. But let's say now you have the diagnosis, what do you do? So unfortunately in Malaysia, there is no platform that you can access, that you get all of the information that you need. A lot of the homework actually has to be done by parents. So in the early stages of receiving an intervention, some clinics, some hospitals, some doctors are kind enough to put together their own list of this is where you can go to. But often a lot of the homework has to be done by the parents themselves. So we do have what's most common in terms of intervention for children with autism or people with autism that tend to be younger in the initial stage of being diagnosed early is speech and occupational therapy, which is the go-to usually. Speech therapy usually addresses speech and communication. Occupational therapy addresses attention, sensory challenges. And the third option would be ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. So this is what ABC does. So ABA is a method of teaching, essentially using the principles of reinforcement. It is very intensive, and because of that, we also see much more rapid improvements in skills. But the go-to tends to be these three. EIP, Early Intervention Program, is a term used very commonly, but essentially any of these interventions in combination is an early intervention. Anything that starts intensively before the age of 5 is early intervention. Yeah, so there are many methods. So it could be ABA, speech, occupational therapy, or a combination of all of it. So we call it multidisciplinary approaches. You know, families can access one-to-one intervention. That's what we do. And there's also group settings. So group settings definitely is very helpful for children that are ready to access and learn to communicate in a social setting, but prerequisites have to be met. And it's also helpful cost-wise because it is group setting.
Yeah, you know, I think the affordability and the access to these support services is a whole other discussion in itself too. And I like when you mentioned it, multidisciplinary approach, because it's not just a one-size-fits-all situation, right? Every individual faces this differently, copes differently. Families also cope differently, and their caregivers as well. I'm a bit curious, what's the regulation surrounding ABA and in terms of to maintain the quality of the service?
So in Malaysia, there's no regulation at all. And we've been talking a lot about this because autism, the numbers that we see, we are seeing an increase of prevalence, and that would mean more people are needing the support, but there is very little regulation, not just in ABA, just in intervention on its own. So it is very common to go to 10 different intervention centers, 10 different clinics. Everybody provides the same service, but in a very different manner. So there's actually very little regulation. ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, actually came from America. In America, it is fully regulated. So you need to receive certain amount of clinical hours and supervision, and you get certification for that, and you need to continue to maintain your education unit, so you need to continuously receive training, and even once you are therapists, you need to continue to receive supervision, for example, from a board-certified behavior analyst, as long as you don't hold that credentials. So, for example, I'm not a board-certified behavior analyst, so if I were to work with a child with autism using the principles of ABA, I actually have to be supervised. Yeah, so that is necessary, but that requirement is not present in Malaysia yet. The biggest reason is relatively ABA is quite new to Malaysia. So in America, it's been applied for about 30-40 years right now. In Malaysia, we are just about 15 to 20 years, so relatively new, half the amount of time. And we also have the lack of people with the right credentials. So there's a saying in America, if you throw a stone, you're going to hit a board-certified behavior analyst. That's how many of them are. But in Malaysia, you can count them by your fingers. There's really not many, because even to receive this education, you had to go elsewhere. So many of them would have returned. And now we're starting to get locally accredited behavior analysts, but this is very recent. So in terms of regulation, it's hard to regulate when you don't have enough professionals that can support the system. We will get there. I'm actually very confident we will, just not right now.
Baby steps.
Yes,
Baby
exactly.
Steps, but the importance of always ensuring there's that monitoring and continuous learning on the therapist's part as well.
Yep.
You talked a little bit about early intervention. How crucial is early intervention when it comes to addressing ASD? Katyana?
I think quite important. I think, again, ASD is just one of it. The same goes for things like ADHD, speech delay. I think any sort of challenge that impacts an individual, the earlier you get a hold of it, the earlier you can address it, the better. With ASD, for example, a lot of the struggles that these children will face are behavioural. You know, there's a lot of repetitive behaviour in some cases, and so having the ability to address it at a young age where behavior change isn't as much of a challenge versus if I was working with, say, a 25-year-old individual who's had 25 years of, living life the way that they do. Working with that becomes a lot harder. And in fact, within sort of the ASD space, a lot of the clients that I work with within sort of the psychology realm are usually these young adults who might not have been assessed and diagnosed early enough, were not able to get the support that they needed. And as a result of many, many years, if not decades of struggle, you start to open the door towards the things like depression and anxiety, because life just was so much harder for them, they felt, in comparison to their peers. So I'm a big fan of early intervention. I do tell parents we are sometimes limited. I've had parents with 5-month-olds walk in and say, can you do a blood test? Can you do something to assess? We are limited because, of course, we need to first identify that the child is meeting milestones, and if they're not yet due to meet those milestones till they're 12 months or so, we can't assess them. They're not delayed yet. So early intervention is a really important part of the intervention process. So whenever parents have identified concerns, I always say there's absolutely no harm in getting it looked into. And if there's a feeling of, they'll outgrow it, we'll give them a few years and outgrow it. I'd say if you're more concerned, just get it looked into, because early intervention can really turn things around. Because like I said, it opens the door for a lot of other mental health concerns if they don't get the support they need when they need it.
That raises my curiosity about the data. Is there existing and updated data when it comes to the number of cases in Malaysia and the consequences of, later intervention, later diagnosis? From your experience, what do you see?
Data is hard to come by, especially locally. I think we rely heavily on the National Health and Morbidity Survey. That's pretty much what we refer to in my office. And that's not consistently looking at these numbers. So I don't, off the top of my head, have the numbers for Malaysia. We do have global statistics based off of like WHO and CDC. But when it comes to Malaysia, we don't. I think a part of that also comes from the fact that we rely on people sort of acknowledging that their children or they themselves have ASD, or that they have, they're on the spectrum. And it still is very much stigmatized. A lot of people do struggle with coming forward and admitting that they are on the spectrum or that their children are. So the numbers are something we take with a pinch of salt. But do you have any numbers for here?
No, the last I checked, I think the last updated numbers was in 2021, I think. And the numbers didn't really make a lot of sense to me because it was so far apart from what we see in more developed nations who are constantly updating their data. So I think, but there's a chicken and egg situation. Number one, of course, I think there's no continuous updates. Secondly, I'm very certain it's underreported.
That ties in with the stigma.
Correct, and then even if you get the data, you just have to add, a certain amount of percentage, and this is affecting more people than we think.
So we're working with sort of very approximate figures here. Are there any misconceptions that both of you have come across with ASD?
Plenty.
Name some of the few, perhaps.
I think for me, like I said, it goes back to just how there is a perception of just how limited or just how little they can actually achieve. I love working with individuals on the spectrum, whether they are on the lower functioning end or the higher functioning end, because there's always things that I feel like I take away from that or I learn from that. I've had a 5-year-old boy school me on every single NASA qualification of every discovery that's ever been found since the dawn of man, and I just sat there in awe.
A walking encyclopedia.
Yes, exactly. And not something that I think a lot of people would immediately think is associated with autism, because again, that's unfortunately, whether it's the role of the media or just lack of awareness, there is this picture painted of someone who is not capable, and that again limits them in a lot of ways. So whenever parents hear that word, immediately you start to see them kind of panic that their child will not be able to be independent, be successful, to live their own life, get married, have a job, all of those things. And I think that is absolutely not true for a lot of them. Yes, there are children and individuals who are going to require a lot of support throughout the rest of their life. But there's a reason why autism is called a spectrum, or it's a spectrum, and there are different levels, because there are people who are capable of all of those things. But that title very much puts that perception that they're not. So a lot of it is about, a lot of what I do is about kind of explaining that to people, explaining that to schools. I've seen, again, going back to the stigma, parents not wanting to formally assess their children out of fear that schools will find out, and schools will insist that they get put into PPKI, which is like the special, classes, or having them removed from school. So I think it's that, to me, is what is the biggest challenge at the moment, is just kind of recognizing that it is not something that means that they are incapable or not, that they can't achieve these things. And then, I think it's about sort of breaking that image, I feel.
Charlene, is there anything you'd like to add on in terms of misconceptions or myths?
Yeah, I think what we know of, at least if you're not in the field, is heavily influenced by media. And media tends to portray either a completely severe case or the complete opposite, like a savant. A majority of the people and children we serve are right in the middle. So how I would explain this to parents is just look at the typical population of neurotypical individuals. It's a bell curve. Most of us fall in the middle. And, the extremes would be very low IQ, and the extreme would be very high IQ, So a majority of us are average, and it's very much the same for the population of autism. A majority of the individuals would fall in between. So it's actually, yes, there are some individuals or children that are severely affected, but it also doesn't mean that every individual is a savant. They are in a genius in a certain area of art or music, It's not as common as most people would think.
From what I'm hearing from the both of you is there seems to be this tendency to tie autism with incompetence, and hence there is that heavy stigma around it when that's really not the case. How then do you think we should approach more open discussions to help reduce that stigma and to promote just greater understanding of ASD in general? Katyana?
The little hack that I do is I always try to normalize it, just as much as once upon a time we thought that diabetes was a death sentence, and we thought that ADHD meant that you couldn't be successful. Time will eventually make ASD, I hope, something that people aren't so afraid of, quote unquote, right? But I think that, so what I do is I essentially say, just like how somebody who has all of these other things are able to live a very healthy and successful and fulfilling life, with the right support, individuals with ASD can do the same. Charlene is right. It isn't the common thing to see people like what the Rain Man portrays, where you are savants and geniuses, but they are more than capable in these cases to sometimes have really fulfilling jobs, have a good group of friends. Some of them are, have really healthy relationships, and so I think it's about kind of showing that there is that capacity is just as normal as somebody who has a medical illness or other types of learning difficulties, because I feel within the demographic that I work with, that transition is easier for them to kind of go, well, yeah, just because somebody has diabetes, for example, or a heart condition, we wouldn't expect that they put their lives on hold, right? So why would I expect the same of somebody who has ASD? So that's kind of the language that I use when I work with people in my setting.
And Charlene, how can we promote greater understanding, more tolerance, inclusivity?
I think this is great.
Okay.
This is a really good step forward. What ABC has been doing is a couple of things, and this has, I think, really helped a lot of families. we have been working with organizations to provide more awareness and inclusivity for families and people with autism. So one of them is Malaysia Airports. You know, we've worked with them to create the butterfly effect. So now families that declare their child has autism or hidden disabilities, because our training covers other things like ADHD, sensory processing disorder, you get this little tag and you get all of the accommodations the team is trained to manage. And that would mean maybe you don't wait for very long on the line, you get a fast pass through, you get access to the calm room, and the traveling becomes more doable, less stressful for families, having a child with different needs, additional needs. We also work with Sunway Malls to do the same thing. We train the staff on the ground, and Sunway Putra was the first autism-friendly mall in Southeast Asia. So the idea behind these initiatives is to get more families and more people with different needs coming out. I think what's really important is they need to be part of the community. If we look 20 years, 30 years back, nobody knew what autism was. If we read the research papers, it is not uncommon to find someone that was institutionalized, thinking they have schizophrenia because there's scripting, there's self-talk. So the misdiagnosis came in and they were put into these mental institutions, but they had autism. So of course we've come so far, but the challenge is when you don't see it, you don't experience everything about the person, their challenges and everything that they can do, because they're completely just locked away, at home. So with these initiatives, we really hope that more families feel comfortable coming out to a restaurant and having a meal, taking that first flight to go on a family holiday. And I think the more we see and expose ourselves to this, and you say like, hey, okay, this is, seems like this child, may have needs, it seems like the parents are doing what they can, or just the awareness of maybe the person next to you may be on the spectrum and they are completely independent, so I think we just need to talk about it more, and people that have awareness that they have autism and they're able to communicate it, it will be great if more awareness about that, they share their experiences, and it just challenges the stereotype. I think the challenge right now is the stereotype is autism equals to no eye contact, you may not be able to go to school, you may not be able to be independent, you have to be cared for by your family your whole life. And that's very scary for most families, but again, that's not a majority of the population. If you receive intervention early, the outcomes of quality of life is incredible. Like so many of our children have gone on to school independently, they are non-verbal to verbal children, and they're living their full life, so it's absolutely possible, but it's very important what happens in the first few years of life. And again, this is relating to individuals that may be more affected, because you can have high functioning autism and be diagnosed at 30 and you didn't know, but you're so functioning that you've learned to cope.
So it's that greater exposure, right? Like you
I
said,
think
rather
that's
than just
absolutely
keeping them at home.
Correct. And I think when you know these facilities are made for families, and say, for example, I have a child with autism and I know that the airport and the malls are inclusive, they welcome, customers or passengers that may need more help, I feel more welcome to be your patron, versus feel like there are many instances, sometimes, it's quite challenging being in a public space and needing to deal with behaviors in the public eye, and that's what keeps a lot of families just keeping their kids at home, and then we don't know really what autism is.
And then we see kind of a bit of a domino effect, because if these individuals and children are kind of kept away, they're not getting the social skills, they're not getting the ability to kind of practice all of these things. And so I find sometimes in cases the symptoms just end up getting more and more exaggerated or a lot worse. So I do 100% agree with Charlene as a mom myself. Like, I get excited if I know the mall has a baby room, and that's just the basic. So for parents who are concerned that their child might have a sensory meltdown, or to have who might need a calm space, knowing that facility is there, knowing that the people on the ground are trained, those are the types of things that I think just kind of add a little bit more comfort and reassurance. And so I think, you know, and then talking about it in forums, you know, such as this is, I think, super important, because we want the public to know that, you know, I think that there's this misconception that Malaysia is very, very far behind. But I say, yes, we've got work to do, but we have a lot of supports that we have, you know, been working really, really hard on for the last 20 years. And so I think that, you know, the intervention options are there. Assessing your child is absolutely possible in like government hospitals even. You don't have to go to private settings. There are multiple types of therapy that are available in this country that people don't know about. And so I think, you know, talking about it is super important. Asking questions is also important. But yeah, and hopefully one day soon, it becomes something that, you know, we normalize, and these individuals and their families won't feel the need to have to hide away because they don't feel like they can function in the community that they're in.
And I think our conversation has largely focused on the responsibility on parents and on the individual and doctors itself. But what role can the community play to help assist individuals on the spectrum? Katyana?
I think it's funny because we talked about this with regards to sort of just parenting in general. Like, what do you do when you see a child having a meltdown, right? And we're trying to encourage more kindness on behalf of the public, you know, and to understand that, you know, those meltdowns are not a sign of bad parenting, you know, that it's a child without the, you know, maturity and the capabilities of expressing how they feel. And the same goes for ASD. So I think, you know, I tell a lot of people, what we're asking of the community is not for you to be therapists and doctors and to know and diagnose and be able to fix what you see. It's really just about understanding and compassion. And if you see someone who is struggling to function, you don't need to go through the Rolodex in your head and figure out whether it's ASD or whether it's ADHD or sensory processing. It's about recognizing that you have another human being who's struggling, and what can you do, if anything at all. So if you see a mom trying to, you know, juggle a child who clearly has needs, if you're willing, go up and ask, is there anything that I can do to help, right? And have them inform you if that's the case, right? And if that is too intimidating for you as a private individual, just practicing the grace of kind of not, you know, making comments or giving them glares and things like that. So there, you know, I feel like it's not as much as people think that we ask for. Just kind of the compassion and the grace to be able to help these families in whatever way that they need. Something as simple as helping mum carry a bag while they walk down the corridor, or to go pick up a tray of food that's been waiting at the counter. Stuff like that that might not be ginormous could make a huge impact to someone who is trying to support their child who's not having a good day. So yeah, that's what I would recommend.
All right, here's to spreading more kindness, fostering more understanding and inclusivity this Autism Awareness Day. That's all the time that we have, but thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your insights with me. I've been speaking to Charlene Marie Samuel and Katyana Azman. This has been It's About Youth with me, Faye Kwan. Thank you for watching, and good night.